Mics, the whispers grew louder inside royal circles. Separate schedules, frosty exchanges, and claims that even palace aides could no longer dismiss. Then, just minutes ago, King Charles and Queen Camilla stepped into public view together, and in a single appearance, they shattered weeks of speculation. But those who watched closely noticed something else entirely. The smiles were there. The distance, some insist, was too. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For days, the conversation surrounding the royal household had moved in only one direction. It started quietly, almost cautiously, in the corners of commentary panels and among long-time royal observers who are usually careful not to overstate what they cannot prove. Then the tone changed. Reports began to suggest that something inside the rhythm of palace life no longer felt familiar. Separate appearances became impossible to ignore. Mom, I see enters that once would have passed unnoticed suddenly carried meaning. And in royal life, meaning has a way of multiplying long before answers arrive. Officially, nothing unusual had happened. There had been no announcement, no statement, no visible disagreement. Yet that absence of explanation became part of the story itself. Commentators pointed to scheduling differences. Others spoke about the strain of public duty during an already demanding period for the monarchy. Some suggested that King Charles' ongoing health concerns had naturally reshaped priorities and appearances. But others, more speculative, more cautious in their wording, wondered whether the explanation was more complicated than logistics. As each week passed, the narrative gained momentum. What had first been dismissed as routine scheduling slowly transformed into a broader question. Why did the public suddenly feel as though they were seeing less of them together? Then came today. The appearance itself should have been ordinary. A royal engagement, public remarks, familiar protocol. Yet the reaction it triggered was anything but ordinary. The moment Charles and Camilla appeared side by side, the conversation shifted instantly. Concern turned into analysis. Analysis turned into scrutiny. Within minutes, every detail became a subject of interpretation. Royal commentators began weighing in not with certainty but with observation. Some argued the appearance projected confidence and continuity. Others suggested that unity presented publicly does not always erase private speculation. Body language discussions emerged almost immediately. Was there warmth? Was there restraint? Were people reading too much into ordinary moments? Or had weeks of silence trained everyone to search for signs that may never have existed? What made the moment feel unusual was not what happened, it was the intensity of the reaction to it. Because in royal history, appearances have never been simply appearances. They are symbols, messages, reassurances. Sometimes they calm questions, other times they create entirely new ones. And today's appearance did something unexpected. It ended nothing. Instead, it opened a new conversation. Because for some observers, standing together proved stability. For others, it raised a different possibility altogether. If everything was normal, why did this appearance feel so significant? That question lingered long after the moment ended. But the rumors hadn't appeared out of nowhere, and insiders claimed the silence before this moment may have mattered more than the appearance itself. Royal absences rarely go unnoticed, but this time, observers say something felt unusually deliberate. Separate engagements became separate headlines, and before long, questions started forming that the palace never directly answered. What made the speculation unusual was not its existence. Royal commentary has always lived in the space between what is seen and what is never explained. But this time, according to to longtime watchers of the monarchy, the pattern felt too consistent to dismiss entirely. One appearance became two, one separate engagement became another. Weeks passed, and gradually, without announcement or acknowledgement, people began noticing that moments once expected to be shared no longer seemed to follow the same rhythm. At first, the explanations sounded ordinary. Schedules evolve. Responsibilities shift. Different members of the royal household often divide public duties to maximize reach. That has happened before, and under normal circumstances, few would have questioned it. But normal circumstances were not the backdrop this time. King Charles continues to carry the weight of a reign unfolding under extraordinary conditions. Public awareness surrounding his health created a different atmosphere around every appearance, every adjustment, every cancellation, and every visible absence. Decisions that might once have appeared practical suddenly began carrying emotional meaning. When expectations become heightened, routine can start looking strategic. Observers began constructing timelines. One appearance alone, then another. Camilla attending obligations independently. Charles appearing without her at moments where some had expected otherwise. Commentators stopped focusing on the events themselves and started focusing on what they believed the sequence represented. The palace, as it often does, remained measured. There were no dramatic denials, no attempts to directly engage with growing narratives. Communications stayed concise and controlled. Public schedules continued. Official updates remained focused on duty rather than discussion. But silence can create its own momentum. The less explanation offered, the more interpretation rushed in to fill the space. Royal commentators debated whether people were simply projecting tension onto ordinary scheduling realities. Others suggested that periods of transition often create distorted narratives around pub-nick figures. Some argued that the monarchy's commitment to restraint had unintentionally allowed speculation to grow unchecked. And then something else happened. The conversation stopped being about what was happening and became about what was missing. People were no longer discussing appearances, they were discussing absence. Every solo engagement became evidence to some. Every scheduling adjustment became a clue. Every unchanged expression became part of an expanding theory that nobody could confirm and nobody seemed willing to abandon. That was the strange turning point, not because proof emerged, but because public curiosity stopped waiting for proof. The narrative had developed its own momentum now, feeding on timing, repetition, and unanswered questions. Even those who doubted the rumors admitted that the atmosphere surrounding the royal household felt different, quieter, more controlled, more carefully managed. And once that perception takes hold, it becomes difficult to reverse. When people are no longer asking what happened, they start asking why nobody is talking. Then came a single event invitation that changed the conversation overnight. If timing is everything in royal life, then this appearance may have been the most carefully timed move of all. By the time the invitation appeared, the atmosphere surrounding the royal household had already changed. Questions had stopped sounding curious and started sounding confident. Commentators no longer asked whether people were reading too much into separate schedules, they began debating what those schedules meant. That shift mattered, because once public perception settles into a narrative, silence alone rarely changes it. And perhaps that is why this moment felt different. Not because the event itself was extraordinary, but because of when it happened. For weeks, observers had watched the conversation accelerate with almost no direct intervention. Official statements remained narrow, public duties concerning. Nude. Yet outside those formal updates, interpretation expanded. The monarchy has always operated on symbolism as much as substance, and when symbols disappear, people instinctively search for replacements. Then came the invitation. Simple on paper, significant in effect. Suddenly, what had been separate became shared again. Reports and commentary began suggesting that palace officials understood exactly what had been developing in public conversation. Not necessarily because there was something to deny, but because perception itself had become part of the story. Royal households do not usually move at the speed of headlines. They move deliberately, often believing that consistency outlasts speculation. But consistency only works when people still trust the pattern. This appearance interrupted the pattern. That is what made it feel strategic. Some interpreted the decision as reassurance, a quiet reminder that partnership still existed beyond headlines and commentary. Others questioned. A reassurance delivered at exactly the right moment becomes something else entirely, a response shaped not by internal reality, but by external pressure. And that distinction became impossible to ignore. Because there is always tension inside public institutions between what is authentic and what must be protected. Royal life has never been built around unrestricted visibility. In many ways, it survives through controlled visibility. Certain moments are amplified, others remain private. Presence becomes communication. Absence becomes communication too, which meant this appearance carried a burden larger than attendance. It had to accomplish something, not dramatically, not openly, but enough to shift attention. Enough to create uncertainty where certainty had started forming. Enough to remind audiences that no one outside palace walls truly sees the complete picture. Yet even that created another layer of interpretation. Because if this was simply routine, why did it feel so intense? National? If it was a spontaneous moment of unity, why did so many people describe it as carefully placed? And if the appearance was designed to reassure, what exactly required reassurance in the first place? Questions like those do not disappear. They evolve. Commentators who once focused on absence now focused on proximity. Analysts who counted separate appearances began measuring interactions. The story transformed again not into proof of conflict, and not into proof of harmony, but into something more powerful. Possibility. Because once audiences begin believing that every royal appearance contains a hidden message, ordinary moments stop being ordinary. They become signals. And once cameras started rolling, every detail suddenly became evidence. A glance, a pause, a measured smile. In royal life, moments lasting seconds can become headlines lasting weeks. Once the appearance began, the conversation changed again. The questions that had dominated previous weeks did not disappear. Masses simply became more focused. Attention shifted away from where Charles and Camilla had been and moved toward how they appeared together now. Suddenly, timing mattered. Small interactions mattered. Even moments that would ordinarily pass unnoticed became loaded with meaning. That is the unusual reality of monarchy. The institution depends on visibility, but visibility comes with a cost. People do not simply watch, they interpret. Within moments, commentary started multiplying. Royal analysts, longtime observers, and audiences who follow every appearance began offering competing readings of the same event. Some described the interaction as steady and familiar, arguing that public speculation had exaggerated ordinary scheduling changes into something larger than reality. Others looked at the same appearance and suggested something more restrained, beneath the surface a sense of carefulness that they believed had not gone unnoticed. Not because anyone claimed to know, but because uncertainty. Monarchy encourages interpretation. The public reaction revealed something interesting. People were no longer looking for statements. They were looking for confirmation of what they already suspected. A delayed response became intentional distance. A measured exchange became quiet tension. A composed appearance became either proof of strength or evidence of effort. The same moments supported completely opposite conclusions. And that may explain why the discussion spread so quickly. Comparisons appeared almost immediately. Previous appearances were revisited. Observers began placing old moments beside new ones, searching for patterns that may or may not have existed. Familiar interactions from months earlier were remembered differently now that recent speculation had reshaped expectations. That is how narratives evolve, not through major revelations, through accumulation. A sequence of ordinary moments begins carrying extraordinary weight, then public memory quietly rewrites itself. Social platform. Mashed forms accelerated the process. Short clips became interpretations. Interpretations became certainty. Certainty became headlines. Entire conversations formed around pauses measured in seconds and exchanges viewed through assumptions built over weeks. People who had never questioned royal scheduling suddenly found themselves analyzing rhythm, consistency, and symbolism. And symbolism has always mattered more to monarchy than most institutions. Because royalty exists in a strange space between public duty and public imagination. Leaders in other systems explain themselves directly. Monarchies rarely do. Instead, appearances become language. Presence communicates. Absence communicates. Shared moments communicate. Even silence communicates. Which means every public appearance carries expectations far beyond the event itself. People are not only asking whether two individuals appeared together. They are asking whether continuity still feels believable. Whether stability still feels intact. Either public confidence matches private reality. That pressure transforms ordinary gestures into national conversation. And perhaps that is why today's appearance generated so much attention so quickly, not because anyone could prove anything had changed, but because people had become convinced that if change existed, it would reveal itself in details too small to ignore. But behind the fascination with body language lies a much larger question about the institution itself. This was never just about two people standing side by side. In the monarchy, every appearance becomes a statement about continuity. That may be why the reaction to this moment felt so much larger than the moment itself. For many people watching, this was never simply about whether Charles and Camilla appeared together after weeks of speculation. It became a question about something older, heavier, and far more difficult to measure: the endurance of the institution during a period unlike any modern reign has faced in decades. Because King Charles did not inherit ordinary circumstances. His reign began beneath enormous expectation and unfolded almost immediately under unusual public conditions. The transition from one historic era into another was always going to bring comparison, scrutiny, and pressure. But layered onto that came something more personal and more human. Public awareness that health concerns had entered the conversation surrounding the monarch himself. That reality changed everything. When a monarch appears during periods of uncertainty, people stop seeing routine and begin searching for reassurance. Every appearance becomes a signal. Every decision becomes symbolic. And every absence becomes larger than it was ever intended to be. That pressure does not remain with one person alone. Camilla's position has carried its own expectations different from previous generations, but no less demanding. Public roles inside monarchy rarely belong entirely to the individuals performing them. They attach to ideas, stability, continuity, support, resilience. Which means when people watch them together, they are often not watching as observers of a marriage. They are watching for evidence that the structure itself remains steady. That expectation can become almost impossible to satisfy. History offers reminders of this pattern. Across difficult periods in royal life, public appearances have often taken on meaning beyond the event itself. Moments of uncertainty created heightened attention. Shared appearances became reassurance. Familiar routines became symbols of persistence. Not because appearances solve private challenges, but because institutions often rely on visible continuity while navigating invisible pressures. And that creates one of monarchy's oldest tensions. The public asks for authenticity. The institution depends on discipline. Private realities continue to exist behind official responsibilities, but public roles rarely pause long enough to explain them. The contradiction has always existed. What changes is how intensely people notice it. Today, the pressure feels greater because audiences no longer wait for formal updates. They interpret in real time. They compare. They analyze. They build narratives from fragments and search for certainty in places where certainty may never arrive. Which means appearances are no longer judged only by what they communicate. They are judged by what people fear they might be concealing. That is why this moment carried so much weight. Not because anyone could prove harmony. Not because anyone could prove division. But because the appearance represented something larger than either possibility. It became a reminder that monarchy survives not only through tradition or ceremony, but through the belief that continuity remains intact, even when circumstances become uncertain. And yet belief, once questioned, has a way of creating new questions of its own. Still, even the strongest public image cannot stop one unavoidable question. Sometimes the biggest royal stories are not built from what happened, but from what people believed might have happened. And perhaps that is the uncomfortable truth sitting beneath everything that unfolded over the past several weeks. Not the appearance itself, not the separate engagements, not even the speculation, but the realization that in modern royal life, perception can become powerful enough to compete with reality. By the time Charles and Camilla appeared together again, the conversation had already moved beyond facts. People were no longer waiting for confirmation because the narrative had become emotionally convincing. That does not make it true, but it does explain why it became so difficult to interrupt. Royal coverage has changed. There was a time when distance protected the institution. Information moved slowly. Silence created patience. Today, silence creates theories. Every adjustment becomes immediate discussion. Every public appearance enters a cycle, notation before the event has even finished. Commentary expands outward traditional reporting, expert analysis, audience reactions, short clips, repeated observations, and somewhere in that process, distinctions begin to blur. Observation becomes suggestion. Suggestion becomes possibility. Possibility starts sounding like certainty. That does not mean people invent concerns without reason. Public figures invite public attention. Patterns can naturally create questions. But questions and conclusions are not the same thing. And that line matters. Because verified reporting operates differently from collective interpretation. One asks what can be supported. The other asks what feels plausible. The challenge is that plausibility can become persuasive long before evidence appears. That tension may explain why the recent speculation grew so quickly. Separate schedules were real. Reduced joint visibility was noticeable. Public discussion existed. Everything after that became interpreted. Notation. Some observers saw signs of careful image management. Others saw nothing unusual at all and argued that audiences had projected anxiety on ordinary royal logistics during a period shaped by health concerns and heightened attention. Both interpretations gained momentum, and once people settle emotionally into a narrative, something else begins to happen. Confirmation bias quietly takes over. People start noticing details that support what they already believe while dismissing details that do not. A shared appearance becomes performance. A comfortable interaction becomes reassurance. A neutral moment becomes hidden tension. The exact same event starts producing entirely different stories. That is what makes royal narratives so enduring. They leave room for interpretation. The monarchy rarely rushes to explain itself, and that restraint creates a vacuum. Sometimes that vacuum protects dignity. Sometimes it invites speculation. Sometimes it does both at once. Which means the question may never have been whether there was truly a rift. The question may be why so many people were prepared to believe there was. Was it concern? Curiosity? Changing expectations? Or simply the modern instinct to assume that every public silence conceals a private truth? There may never be a clear answer, and perhaps that uncertainty is exactly why the story captured so much attention. Because ambiguity has a strange power. It keeps people watching. It keeps people comparing. It keeps people returning to moments that never fully explain themselves. Yet whether true or exaggerated, the reaction revealed something deeper. The appearance lasted minutes. The message may last much longer. By the time the conversation reached this point, it no longer belonged entirely to Charles and Camilla. Something larger had taken over. The public response revealed a shift that has been building quietly for years, a changing expectation about what monarchy should be in a modern age. Once, distance itsy. ILF was part of the institution's authority. Privacy reinforced mystique. Silence protected dignity. Today, that equation feels less certain. Modern audiences expect access. Not complete access, perhaps, but enough transparency to feel connected to the people carrying public responsibility. And when that expectation meets an institution built on restraint, tension appears almost immediately. That tension was present beneath every discussion surrounding this appearance. People were not simply asking whether the king and queen appeared together. They were asking whether the institution understood what people needed to see, because public confidence has become more complicated than ceremony alone. Continuity must still feel visible. Stability must still feel believable. And appearances, fairly or unfairly, have become one of the primary ways people measure both. That is why moments like this carry unusual weight. A royal appearance is never only attendance. It becomes reassurance to some, a message to others, a test to many. What might have once been interpreted as routine now feels symbolic. Not because monarchy changed overnight, but because the environment around it did. Media cycles move faster. Commentary spreads instantly. Audiences no longer consume royal coverage passively, they participate in it. Every moment is discussed, compared, reframed, and redistributed before official narratives even have time to settle. That creates a new reality for institutions built on patience. Each appearance becomes more than a public duty. It becomes a referendum, not on policy, not on decisions, but on confidence itself. People begin asking difficult questions. Does the institution feel stable? Does leadership feel present? Does continuity feel secure? And because those questions rarely receive direct answers, audiences start searching for signals in places where signals may never have been intentionally placed. That is what made this moment feel different. It escaped the boundary, ease of ordinary royal coverage. This was not celebrity fascination. Celebrity stories usually revolve around personality. This felt tied to something broader: ideas of endurance, responsibility, and whether institutions still know how to communicate in an age that expects constant interpretation. The irony is that the appearance itself may never fully answer any of those questions. Perhaps it was reassurance. Perhaps it was routine. Perhaps it was simply two public figures continuing public work while carrying private realities no audience can fully understand. But the response showed that expectations have changed. People no longer watch royal appearances only to see who attends. They watch to understand what attendance means. And when meaning becomes the main event, even ordinary moments begin carrying extraordinary significance. Which may explain why this appearance continues to linger long after it ended. And in the end, one final image remained. They arrived under a cloud of question. They left beneath a wave of interpretation. But perhaps that was always the point, because after everything, the speculation, the analysis, the endless effort to decode meaning from silence, the moment itself remained surprisingly simple. Two senior royals appeared together, and yet what followed revealed something far more complicated. For weeks, people had built narratives in the absence of certainty. Questions multiplied because answers never fully arrived. Separate appearances became symbols. Ordinary scheduling became possibility. Possibility became discussion. Discussion became expectation. Then came one shared appearance. Not dramatic enough to erase every doubt. Not revealing enough to confirm every theory. Just enough to interrupt the momentum. And maybe that is why the reaction felt so immediate. For a brief moment, certainty disappeared again. People who had become convinced of distance reconsidered. People who had dismissed every rumor looked back more carefully. Interpretation shifted almost in real time. The same audiences that had spent weeks searching for signs of separation suddenly began searching for signs of unity. But the truth is, public narratives rarely move in straight lines. They expand, they contract, they return. That is especially true when institutions carry both public responsibility and private complexity. Because monarchy has always lived inside contradiction. It must appear stable while remaining human. It must feel enduring while adapting constantly. It must project continuity even as circumstances inevitably change. And perhaps that is why moments like this continue to matter more than they seem to. Not because appearances reveal everything, but because they reveal just enough to keep people invested in what comes next. There was no dramatic resolution, no definitive ending, no announcement that explained every absence or answered every question. Only a moment that people interpreted through their own expectations, hopes, cons, morans, and assumptions. And maybe that uncertainty is not a weakness of the story. Maybe it is the story. Because institutions built across generations are rarely understood through single appearances. Their meaning forms slowly, through repetition, through endurance, through the accumulation of moments that seem ordinary until viewed together. That is why this appearance may continue to matter long after headlines move on. Not because it proved harmony, not because it disproved tension, but because it reminded people of something they had almost forgotten while searching for hidden meaning. Public life is not always transparent. Silence does not always mean conflict, and visibility does not always mean certainty. Still, for all the analysis and all the competing interpretations, one image remained at the center of everything. After weeks of questions, they appeared together. That fact alone became enough for some. For others, it became the beginning of entirely new questions. And perhaps, my son emerged, so that is where royal stories endure, not in clear answers, but in the space between what is known, what is imagined, and what remains carefully protected. The appearance ended. The conversation did not, because legacy is rarely built in moments of clarity. It survives in periods of uncertainty. And whether this moment becomes remembered as reassurance, strategy, routine, or something else entirely, history will likely treat it the same way royal history often treats these moments, with distance, interpretation, and unanswered questions left quietly intact. Whether the appearance ended the speculation or simply paused it, one thing became impossible to ignore. In royal life, silence creates headlines, but presence rewrites them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.